Chapter Twominus 1. The future is grey. Summer 1968. The door was slammed shut with the most thunderous of sounds as cries and loud thumps took over and reverberated throughout the townhouse. On the other side of the door sat a young boy of age 8, and this was hardly the first time the child had experienced such an event. His name was Marcus Gray, and what he was currently hearing was nothing more than a drunk episode of his father, who, whilst being under the spell of liquor, had convinced himself that his wife had been unfaithful, and he had taken it upon himself to carry out the punishment for just such a terrible crime. This, however, was hardly the case, as Marcus's mother had committed no such deed and was crying out in profound desperation with nobody around to help. Unfortunately, the man was entirely unresponsive to the wails of the unlucky woman, as he was blinded and driven solely by rage. This memory would forever become imprinted into the young boy's mind. "You dumb lying whore!" the man yelled at the top of his lungs in between strikes, succumbed fully to disdain. "Why did I buy you this jewellery? And the clothes? So that you can go off and get fucked by someone else? You dumb, unfaithful cunt." The man's verbal assault was unrelenting, much like the physical one, however. A moment of silence would eventually make its long-awaited arrival, while the woman would take this instant, mustering all she could to respond. The wife's voice was quite anemic as a product of the savage beating she had undergone. With the feeble tone she began to speak. "I am sorry, David. It won't happen again, I swear." The lady admitted to guilt, despite being completely innocent of the accused misdeed. A dire effort this was to conclude the assailment and escape the perdition. The man was having none of it, however, as he laughed briefly before once again commencing to yelling, "You think I am going to trust a lying slut?" He shouted while resuming the display of disheartening brutality, with each blow heavier than the other. David hit his wife again and again, however. The boy was no longer around to hear those deeply disturbing sounds anymore. The young Gray ran all the way upstairs in an attempt to find solace from this tragic occurrence. The child was now in his room with his headphones on and the music blasting, masking the wails and screams of the young wife, the kid's unfortunate mother. The little one cried while listening to his music, as he was unable to keep his mind off what was currently happening down below. The youngster desperately wanted to call the police, or the neighbours, or anyone else that could help for that matter, but he couldn't. He promised his mother to not commit such an act, in fear of what might happen to them both as a result of retaliation. The boy was overwhelmed by dread, still sobbing, and now beginning to shudder. Suddenly a reprieve from the violence and another moment of quietude. The door to the room where the beating took place was now open, the torture chamber as far as the woman of the house was concerned. Only the one person exited this room, however, and it was the man himself. He bolted out, quickly making his way across multiple rooms, walking with determination in an effort to reach the room which the young boy now occupied. Pictures were scattered all over the place, some broken and some not. Nevertheless, all captured a much happier time in the history of this family. The home was a beautiful one indeed, as the man flashed past the scenery inside. Rugs, many shelves filled entirely with books, handcrafted lamps, tables and chairs were just some focal points of this residence. Such works of craft were made by the man of the house, who was a woodworker by trade. The walls of the residence were all hand-painted, and this was done by the woman of the household, who herself was an artist by profession. David was now face to face with the door to his son's room, with it being the only barrier separating the young Marcus from the imminent threat. The big man attempted the handle, but the door was locked. Fury once more consumed the husband as he began to violently pound on the wooden obstacle. The force of these hits was felt throughout the house. In fact, Marcus Gray jumped at the very first hit, despite being engulfed in the roaring aura that the headphones created. "Open up, Marcus!" the man yelled through the door, which muffled his voice quite so, yet a great sense of anger was still easily distinguished. Marcus remained silent, afraid the little one was. "Open the fuck up!" One more request by the man was made, only this time the level of aggression had vastly toppled the previous instances. "You know I can break this door with ease, don't you, Marcus?" The man was now fed up and had committed himself to bashing the door down should the need arise. After this comment, Marcus decided to shatter his silence as the realization set in. The young child said in a light voice while still sobbing. It was just barely audible, in fact. Marcus did as he promised and unlocked the door, after which he quickly ran into the corner, where he curled up in a ball while the shudders continued to dominate his tiny body. The man entered the room swiftly, and while scanning the area, he failed to spot Marcus right off the bat. However, not much time was needed in order for him to succeed in this effort. David saw the boy and began to approach him at a slow and methodical pace. While walking towards his son, David started to speak. "How much did you hear of what happened down there?" the man inquired in a surprisingly calm tone. An interval of time had elapsed in complete silence before Marcus did finally produce a response. "All of it, I think," Marcus answered without looking at his dad, and instead staring at the floor. "What do you think happened between the two of us?" David made another inquisition of the boy, retaining his composure. "I don't know. I really don't." The young Marcus was entirely sincere in his answer, with his frail voice wavering. "Your mother has been acting naughty, as of late. She has been doing things she wasn't supposed to." David spoke while explaining the situation to Marcus, clearly not desiring to seem like the wrong party in this particular instance. Daddy had to correct Mommy's actions, Marcus, or else she would never learn. "Do you understand?" David concluded with another question, as sternness began to show her presence deep within the man's tonality. "First, I understand." Marcus, while most certainly answering the way his father would want, was hardly honest in his response. As the young boy understood full well that this incident of the violence was no different from the ones prior, and that his mother was truly undeserving of such a punishing treatment. "Will she be okay?" Marcus asked as his sobbing intensified. The father chose not to answer the question and instead proceeded with an inquiry of his own. "Look at you, boy, crying over a woman. Don't you think it's pathetic?" David asked his son, disappointed deeply in him. The young Gray was somewhat confused by this remark, yet it didn't take him long to provide a response. "First, I don't know. I just love my mom," the boy blurted out while still weeping uncontrollably. David did not follow with any more inquiries or comments, and instead just smiled at his son. David then stood up and walked out of Marcus's room, closing the door behind him. A small amount of time had passed, and the front door of the townhouse was heard opening and closing almost immediately after. Seemingly, the man of the house had vacated the building. This gave Marcus the opportunity he needed to rush downstairs in order to aid his mother. When the young boy entered the room where the unfortunate event took place, he saw his mother lying motionless on the floor. Marcus's first thoughts were horrifying and debilitating as he considered to himself that the woman whom he loved more than anything else in the world might have been left for dead inside her own house. Luckily for the young Marcus, this was not quite the case, and as he neared his mother, he saw her not just breathe, but even speak. "I am sorry, Marcus," Evelyn articulated, staring directly at the ceiling while speaking in a fragmented and defeated tone. "I could not protect you once again." This time the mother turned her head towards the young child, who was now clasping her hand. "I can never protect you." The woman continued in a broken voice, while struggling to get her words out completely. The young Marcus responded, having his eyes now directed and focused on his mother. "Don't talk right now, Mom," the little one said with overwhelming compassion surfacing. "I am going to go and find some medical supplies." Marcus then let go of his mother's hand and proceeded to do just as promised, bolting through the house while looking for the first aid kit. Before long, the young Grey found exactly what he was looking for. He then rushed back to his mother and did the best imitation of a doctor he could. This, after all, was not the first time he had to patch up his own mama. Some time later, and the mother of the house was finally back on her feet. Evelyn and Marcus were both sitting in the kitchen in complete silence while deep contemplation had devoured them both. The woman then finally broke the optic fixation she established with the floor, looked at her son, and uttered, "We leave tonight, Marcus. Get your stuff ready, all that you need and want. We leave tonight," the woman said in a commanding yet still compassionate voice. Marcus, without any retort, stood up and headed upstairs to accommodate his mother's instructions. Hardly any time had passed, and the two were ready and fully packed, with the boy standing by the front door, anticipant. Evelyn was found walking around the house, turning every single light off, and once this act was complete, the front door of the townhouse was once again heard opening and closing soon after, only this time. The location was left completely silent, dark, and empty. The steel wheels striking the steel alloy tracks created a soothing and enchanting reverie for the young Marcus as he sat motionless in his seat aboard the locomotive, looking through the window of the metal horse, observing the scenery scrupulously. Across from the young one sat his mother, and for the first time in a seemingly long time, the woman had a smile of genuine happiness across her face as she intently gazed at her only son. The duo had finally made their escape, and this was no small feat for the two members of the family, since they had fractured the shackles of paralyzing fear at last. The mother's plan, which the young boy had very little say in, was to reside with her sister for a time while Evelyn and Marcus searched for a new home, and with it, a new life. Marcus had shown some reservations, however, as the new city the two were now travelling to was none other than London. A huge and vibrant metropolis this most assuredly was, filled with many people of many different backgrounds, and it was exactly this that scared the young Marcus. The boy did struggle with agoraphobia and was anxious of starting fresh in just such a foreboding environment. Still, this was quite a welcome development in the life of the mother and the son, as it was very much an improvement. Evelyn and Marcus had arrived at their destination, and once no longer inhabiting the modern caravan, the two were greeted by the aforementioned sister. "Welcome to London," Helen declared elated, almost screaming in fact, as she saw her sister and nephew depart the train. Whoa, you scared me, Helen. I didn't expect you to be on time." The mother spoke truthfully, since her sister had quite the poor reputation when it came to punctuality. "Oh, don't start with that now, Evelyn. Just a minute after you get off the train and you are already busting the balls I don't even have." Helen's words were coated with a layer of friskiness. "And look at you, Marcus." The aunt had now diverted her attention towards her little nephew with a welcoming smile. "You grew some. Soon you will be as tall as my poodle." Helen spoke with sarcasm present. However, Marcus was abnormally short for his age, and this was often brought up, not just by his aunt, but also by other members of the family as well. Nice to see you too, Aunt Helen, even if you are busting the balls I do have," Marcus retorted with confidence, taking the previous comment in full stride. Helen laughed at the young boy's response. "Who needs height when you have wit? Isn't that right, Marcus?" Helen concluded the exchange concerning male anatomy. Shortly after, Evelyn had made her return back into the conversation. "Perhaps we should start heading to your flat now, Helen." Evelyn said this with a slight hint of frustration. However, this did not register with her sister. Despite, Helen was more than happy to oblige with Evelyn's request. "Certainly the station smells like it's been doused with piss anyway. So many homeless have been living here recently," the aunt said while gazing at a homeless man who was laying on one of the benches near the trio. "Follow me to the car now, and Marcus, make sure to keep close." The boy. The mother and her sister grabbed all the bags the two had brought along and began their journey to the car through the delightfully scented train station. With the sedan now in motion, Marcus was in the back seat while the two women were up front, enveloped in conversation concerning mostly the man who Evelyn had just recently left. Needless to say, there weren't many kind words present amidst this exchange. However, Evelyn was fully capable and willing to take the blame where it was deemed appropriate. As the young mother would often point out that it was in fact she who chose to marry the man to begin with and to stay with him for as long as she had. Her sister, on the other hand, was much less reciprocal of this notion and was barraging the man with remonstrance mercilessly. Marcus stayed quiet while the two were having their fiery discussion, choosing instead to ruminate over his father not at all. Marcus would instead daydream about the new life that would await him while carefully observing the outside through yet another window. The city was lively, and this was no surprise to the young boy. Constant commotion, constant conversation, and all sorts of different sounds, some discernible and some not, were caging the young child as they drove closer and closer to the flat of the sister. Finally, the lengthy drive from the station was over, the car was parked, and the trio began to egress the automobile. Whilst in the middle of just that act, a verbal exchange had sprung. "You two can stay here as long as you want, you know," Helen said with a welcoming tone. "It really isn't much of a bother at all since I live alone and all," the woman added while beginning to grab the luggage from the trunk. "Thanks, sis, but we don't want to become too complacent," Evelyn answered almost instantly while looking at her son, who was helping his aunt with the luggage bags. "Besides, the centre of the city is far too hectic for Marcus and me. It can be too much, you know." Evelyn continued the conversation as she had now also joined her sister and son in the act of container removal. "I understand. You two are used to the little quiet town life from previously." Helen wasn't lying, as her tone was filled with understanding indeed, and for those who are wondering, the bags were now, in fact, completely withdrawn from the trunk's caress. "I will start looking for a job in this city right away, and shortly after that, Marcus and I will be looking for a place to live of our own," Evelyn stated in a stern manner while her son was looking around at the animated streets nearby. "Already ahead of you on the job front there, sis." Helen was now speaking in a cheerful voice with satisfaction blanketing it. "I talked to my boss at my job, and he agreed to interview you for the illustrator position for the paper, and I didn't even have to sleep with him to guarantee it." The little Marcus had smiled at his aunt's remark regarding a certain adult act. "I think it's what they call progress now, isn't it?" Helen said, while barely holding back the laughter and instead forming a gruntled smile across her face. The affable auntie did in fact work for the local newspaper as a journalist, and she was in fact close with the higher-ups. Evelyn reciprocated with the grin herself and proceeded to respond to her sister shortly after. "Thanks, sis. I don't know what I would do without you." Evelyn responded with sincerity, as she was visibly relieved to hear just such news, having started to lift the bags up from the ground in preparation for movement. "Yes, thanks a lot, Aunt Helen." The little Marcus chimed in while grabbing the smallest case himself. "Thanks doesn't bubble, you know." The aunt responded with a heavy dose of jest while referencing a certain flammable substance. As Aunt Helen elevated the very last case from the asphalt while smiling, she added, "Now, let's go inside and get the two of you situated." The trio then proceeded to do just that as they made their way towards the front door of the flat and through the main entrance. Over the following months, Evelyn and Marcus had indeed remained lodged with the charming woman that was Helen. This was a development that pleased all the parties involved seemingly, as Helen was more than welcoming when it came to her sister and nephew. Additionally, Evelyn had acquired the illustrator position at the local newspaper, the London Daily, acing the interview process itself while demonstrating quite the astounding artistic ability once fully hired on. It does have to be said that the woman possessed quite the immense talent when regarding just such endeavours, and in fact the mother's gift was multi-layered, as she continued to paint and even sculpt when time allowed it. Evelyn was making grand heaps while working for the publication and was swiftly becoming a standout employee, creating some real daylight between herself and the rest of the staff. This wasn't all simply due to her natural talents, however, as the woman was unflinchingly driven, with her young boy Marcus being the main impetus. Speaking of the little one, Marcus was residing in a great state of delight, while Summer governed the lively city with her benevolent radiance. The young boy, however, was not a typical child, as he very much preferred his own company, as you see. Marcus possessed an elephantine amount of ability himself, much like his mother. He was a very sharp and creative youngling, and as a result of just such a vast foundation of potential, the young one had great difficulty establishing meaningful connections with other children of his age. The few attempts to create friendships that Marcus undertook had all ended in the same disappointing and demoralizing fashion. They were all grand failures, to put it bluntly. Additionally, the boy struggled significantly with the ones of the opposite sex, as Marcus was not a boy of a large frame by any means, and as a product of just this, was often ridiculed and bullied by other boys. "Hey, you!" A rather unwelcoming voice suddenly pierced the stillness of the park located nearby Aunt Helen's house. Marcus Gray was one of the only occupants of this particular section of the park. The harsh remark was clearly directed at him. "Have not seen you around? You new here or something?" The same voice continued with the same exact hostile undertone. Once the little Gray registered both of the uncongenial sentiments, the boy turned around to face the source of this fairly superfluous aggression. While there was only the one voice, there were in fact 3 individuals who had evinced themselves in front of Marcus's eyes. 2 boys of age 12, if one had to take a guess, and a girl who appeared to be ever so slightly younger than her male company. With the eye contact now made between all who were involved in this exchange, it continued. "We are the ones that hang out at this section of the playground." The other young man had now made his debut into the discourse while mimicking the frigid tone of his friends. "You must be new here to not know that." The additional comment made by the 12-year-old was now seeping with threat. It does rain often in this city." Marcus began to respond to the aggressors, having himself displayed a level of confidence in his voice. "So I guess the water must have washed away your names from the sign in this section of the park." Gray concluded while assertively staring the newly met instigators. The younger female accompanying the boys smirked at the Marcus's fairly bold retort, which in turn had visibly agitated the 2 males. It's too bad it didn't wash you away as well." The original aggressor now spoke yet again, smirking briefly after his comment was made. "Let's see if we can change that." He then quickly added and started to manoeuvre himself towards Marcus, whilst his other male sidekick followed closely by. Not much of an acumen is required to understand what happened next, as there was a brawl indeed. The little Marcus stood no chance against the two older males, and while he most certainly did not go down without a fight, he did go down in the end. Stricken down and overwhelmed, the little grey laid on the ground of the park thoroughly defeated, yet this display of senseless violence did not stop at this juncture. The two boys continued their unrelenting assault, having now opted to kick the defenceless little Marcus whilst he was occupying the earth. The girl could bear this spectacle no more, having never been on board with such a development to begin with, in all truth. The little and dauntless lady rushed to the site of the attack and violently shoved one of the assailants off the helpless Marcus. The force behind the push proved to be enough of a deterrent on this occasion. However, she was not quite done yet. The girl then proceeded to vigorously berate both young boys into a submission of sorts, as the attack was now entirely ceased. The two boys began to walk away from the scene of the crime, as the lady opted to stay behind momentarily to glance at Marcus, who was now beginning to slowly sit back up, grasping his sides in order to lessen the pain. The two had then briefly made eye contact, and all that Gray had seen once this optic reciprocation had occurred was a deep sense of shame buried within the little girl's enchanting blue eyes. The pair had broken the lock of the sight, with the young lady now beginning to follow the duo of attackers. Having little fortune in such social affairs, avoidance became the name of the game for the young Marcus Gray, as he spent the overwhelming majority of his time playing the role of a self-imposed prisoner, whilst inside the walls of his aunt's house, reading and even painting himself. Truth be told, this was a rather satisfactory arrangement for Marcus, as he clearly and vastly outshined the rest of the children within his age group. However, this solitary expression would eventually discover its termination, as the gentle Summer was now beginning to make her departure, with her elegant sister Autumn preparing to make her arrival. The young boy would soon once again return to school, albeit this time his academic adventure would be located within the grandiose city of London, and not in a little convivial town. This was quite the change of scenery, and with just such drastic alterations come drastic adaptations. Or so one would hope, at least. However, honesty is a concept you never violate, and this tale is not about to make such an egregious transgression. With heavy candour present, it has to be expressed that the youthful Marcus had more than just an abominable experience while enrolled in one of the city's biggest schools. No longer having the safety of the confines of the house, Marcus would once again be mercilessly bullied by his peers, with the boy often having quite the disconcerting bruises to show for it even. Frankly, certain children would often find themselves collapsing under the dense stones of envy, as Marcus would demolish any and all academic obstacles thrown his way, and furthermore, the little one would perform just such demolition jobs with unmatched ease. Intellectually, Marcus was in a league of his own, surpassing the rest with little effort required, yet violence had often played the role, as per usual, of the great equalizer. Chapter Tominus 2. The future is grey. As months and years went by, Marcus's existence remained one filled with discouraging cruelty, which in turn was quite the contrast to the kingdom of fulfilment which the boy's mother had found herself the queen of. Evelyn had made it up the corporate ladder, so to say, with admirable quickness and an unwavering determination. In addition, the woman had achieved great success, selling her artistic expressions in the form of paintings, and had established herself within this atmosphere as well as her work-related one. All was going swimmingly for the still young and still striking, driven mother, and with the fruits of her great achievements, she had purchased quite the impressive, yet compact home within the parameters of the magnificent city that was London. Marcus loved his mother more than anything on the planet, and had hardly been oblivious to the woman's newly found state of intoxicating elation. The young boy was entirely unwilling to pierce the bubble of happiness his mother was engulfed in with the blade of reality which the boy had been experiencing. This reality was, of course, coated with a layer of turmoil and suffering, and this was all the more reason for the youngling to keep his current predicaments locked away and depressed deep within himself. In order to keep the illusion afloat, Marcus would often cover up the bruises he had received while in school, utilizing his mother's make-up. And when any conversations concerning the topic of school violence did surface, the quick-witted Gray would derail that specific train of thought immediately, mentioning his unequalled academic achievements instead. Marcus's mother found herself often occupying places other than their home, which made Marcus's effort of confidentiality all the easier. One shouldn't perceive the mother as an absent one, however, as she provided for the family and kept the balance of all her responsibilities to her best capacity. Of course, there was the matter of a patriarch, as a boy needs a father. At least that's the theory, and it is one which the woman had very much subscribed to. Evelyn began looking for a suitable father to her son to fill the deep cavity that was left after her first, unsuccessful marriage had tragically crumbled. This was a task easier said than done, since Evelyn, for all her strengths, had a rather prominent weakness. Simply put, the woman loved bad boys. In fact, she never truly had gotten over her first love, the very same one who had left her in the state of complete diminution and degradation on multiple occasions. As so often the case, nature governs the person and not the other way around. Evelyn would become involved in many different relationships, with one after the other producing the same predictable and distressing result. As she would part ways with the would-be fathers relatively soon after getting initially encompassed. The men entering her life intermittently had all shared a very similar characteristic between them, as they were all quite the rabble-rousers, completely unafraid, and often even ill-mannered. Some were drunkards, and some were fighters, but all were hardened bad boys. A charming quality to some, undeniably, but hardly one which many would consider one belonging to a good father figure. Evelyn was not a stupid woman, and she was fully understanding of just that fact. This revolving door of potential fathers, if you will, would continue on for some time until she had finally found the one, so to speak. The 28-year-old mother had met a man by the name of Adrian Clark. This man was not quite like the other potential companions Evelyn had entangled herself with in the most recent past, as he was once a soldier, and had even participated in the Normandy Battle of 1944 during World War II. Quite the find this was for the young and lovely woman. On the matter of age, however, there was a considerable gap in years between the two, a April 17th, 2024 difference to be exact. This was not a concern for the woman, as she thought she had finally found the most suitable candidate to fill the shoes of the ever-so-elusive Popper. Unsurprisingly, many men, and women for that matter, keep their darkest secrets hidden away from the reach of others, and this was no exception for Mr. Clark, who carried a rather heavy burden of mental instability on his shoulders. This frailty was a product of the war. Once the conflict was through with him, the man had undergone a significant change of character, having seen and experienced things that very few are truly prepared for. Not long after his homecoming from the laborious fighting, Clark began to succumb to what can only be described as delusional episodes, during which he would forfeit his ability of control, often resulting in acts of violence. The man had become dysfunctional indeed. He sought help for this newly formed affliction and was provided with medication by the military in hopes of mitigating or possibly even eliminating these unfortunate spells. What was even more unfortunate, however, was that the medication proved to be rather ineffective, leaving the man in a state of true desperation. But Clark was hardly one governed by weakness, as he found a way to contain the episodes when they did arrive, at the most inconvenient of times, of course. Additionally, Clark had also begun to self-medicate, with his choice of remedy being one of the oldest ones around. This cure-all was none other than alcohol. Eventually, Clark seemed to have regained control over this debilitating disease and had even successfully acquired work. After his rather protracted career in the military, Clark had re-entered the civilian world as a machinist, working for an auto manufacturing company based in London, England. Clark's life had finally stabilised. On his off time, Clark had found escape from his ailment in not only liquor, however, but also in the shape of art, as shocking as that might seem to some. In fact, this was how Evelyn and Adrian had first made their acquaintance with one another. "Do you want me to help you understand what it means?" Evelyn inquired in a truly cordial tone while in motion once she witnessed the man attentively scrutinizing one of her paintings on display in front of him. The two were inside of a local art gallery, with the woman's most recent works having been showcased as the main exhibit. "I kind of want to try to figure it out myself, actually," the man responded earnestly with a resonant bass, while a slight rasp accompanied it. What this man was scrupulously inspecting was an abstract piece, which consisted of leaves and roots of all sorts of different colours, making up a contour of a human being. Having said that, this was not something that was overtly obvious. "All right, I give up," he then suddenly stated, with the woman now standing adjacent to him, as both had now devoted their vision towards the vivid artistic expression. "It's supposed to symbolize nature being a part of us, and us being a part of nature, hence why the roots and leaves come together to complete a human." The woman spoke while retaining the affable tone, and now revealing to the man the part she was just recently mentioning, as she slid her finger across the painting to pinpoint those exact characteristics. "The leaves are all different colours, because we all come in different colours." "It's dumb, I know." Evelyn had suddenly stopped her explanation, losing a battle to self-doubt. "But since it's abstract, most people can't even figure it out, so I can often get away with silly things like that," she concluded in a delicate voice, having now begun the process of reclaiming her confidence. "Interesting," the man stated while intently staring at the amalgamation of hues, slowly beginning to recognize the patterns inside the piece. "What did you think it was?" Evelyn inquired, platformed on suspense with the podium on top crafted with the material of eagerness. "The male genitalia," the man responded, still consumed by the painting, having produced a slight smirk immediately after his answer. Evelyn reciprocated with an audible laugh of her own, most definitely not expecting such a candid response. "I saw a lot of them in the painting, but that might be a personal thing, you know." The man now turned to Evelyn with the heartwarming grin encasing more and more of the territory that was his face. "It's really that bad, huh?" the woman inquired, yet her words did not carry the weight of irritation. In fact, the woman seemed to have had appreciated the man's honesty, quite so. "No, not at all." Adrian continued speaking while once again returning his gaze onto the work. "It is very well made. I just don't understand much about this stuff. I am new to all of this." "You know?" Evelyn's eyes kept shifting back and forth between the man and her work while he continued talking. "I only started coming to this gallery not that long ago." The newcomer had ceased his explanation. "Do you like it, though? My painting?" The woman's inquest was filled with great anticipation yet again. Certainly, terse and honest the man was. "Would you have liked it more if they were the male, you know?" Evelyn was brazen, but not that brazen as it turned out. "What are you trying to say there, miss?" Clark was full of smiles once he finished his inquiry, having shifted his sight onto the pretty woman once more. "Nothing. Nothing at all." She quickly recanted with slight nervousness hiding deep within. "Besides, there is nothing wrong with that anyway." Evelyn had concluded the rather awkward exchange about the male sexual anatomy while sounding just as awkward herself. Shortly after, the pair had both directed their vision on the painting while silence filled the air. This silence, however, did not stay long as Evelyn began to speak again. "You said you just started coming here. I never saw you here before. What is your name?" The woman's intrigue might as well have been her best friend, as it never quite left her side throughout the entirety of the discourse. "I was actually going to let you ask me that during our dinner, but now I am fairly convinced that you think I am gay, so that might complicate matters a little." The man stated with his eyes off the woman, but an inviting smile present and a tonality of stupendous self-assurance. Evelyn was pleasantly shocked, as the man had produced quite the surprising response yet again. "Wait."
Evelyn had taken the slightest of respites.
"Are you asking me, oh—" The artist was not able to finish her inquiry, obstructed by the man with the male genitalia on his mind. "Well, maybe not." "Out." The man finished the question for her. "Yeah, I'm asking you out. That's exactly what's going on here." His inducing gaze fell upon the woman de novo. "And before you ask me this, no, I am not of a homosexual orientation." The man smiled while the woman laughed, as the two had found themselves under the unexpected, yet fervid umbrella of fascination. The pair had formed a bond almost immediately after their initial meeting, and the glue of rapport that was to hold them together was powerful, to say the least. This was an establishment that made both Evelyn and Adrian quite content, in fact, as they had found themselves in dire need of a partner, albeit for different reasons. The two had carried on with their newly coalesced union, and once the picture of the relationship between the pair had become more vibrant and complete, Evelyn had introduced Marcus to his soon-to-be stepfather. On the glorious day of the wonderful month of August, in the ripping year of 1971, ceremonies reigned supreme as the woman once again wore the majestic bridal white, only this time. Her man of choice would not dare to lay a finger on his beautiful and rather successful wife. Little Marcus, however, was not so lucky. A year and a half after the two had exchanged their vows, and things could not have been going along smoother, as Evelyn and Adrian's link, which was made of the metal alloy of affection and admiration, would continue to strengthen as time progressed. The condition of marriage did not enslave the woman's ambitions, as she had resumed on with her career, and of course her art. The man remained working at the factory while obtaining a promotion himself, yet the struggle produced by his medical constraint remained with him. However, the man would fight it off again and again, coming out on top seemingly at all times, whilst caught in this horrendous conflict. Now, it does have to be stated that while Evelyn knew of the man's past and his struggles, she had not been presented the entirety of the truth, as Adrian deemed such revelation unnecessary. Due to the fear of losing the woman who had brought him the much-needed reprieve from the despotism of his oppressive medical disorder. One of the pieces of information which Clark opted to obfuscate was his heavy use of alcohol, since Evelyn had quite the unpleasant past when it came to just that substance. The man would be extremely heedful in choosing his opportunities when it came to partaking in the act of drinking. Nevertheless, many of times when Evelyn would be out on business or preoccupied with other efforts, Clark would be left alone inside the house with the young Marcus. "Where in the hell did I put that damn thing?" Clark's voice was drenched with annoyance as he surveyed the house, desperately seeking his panacea. "I moved it, Mr. Clark," little Marcus Gray mirthfully responded, to his stepfather's self-imposed inquiry having entered the room silently. "My mother was about to clean there, so she would have found it." The boy then added as he directed his eyes towards the place in question. The place in question was the bookshelf, more specifically a nook of the recently mentioned construct that had played the role of a hiding spot to near perfection. The deeply surprised, yet thankful Adrian proclaimed. "Good thinking, boy. Where did you move it to exactly?" he then inquired in a warm tone while nearing the child. "It's at the bottom of the laundry basket." The child spoke with major pride. "It's only halfway full, so Mom was not wanting to do it before she left the city," the boy concluded as he watched the man slowly leave the room the two were inhabiting. A short time later, and the ex-soldier had once again returned, only this time he was reunited with his good friend. Once fully enveloped by the comforting atmosphere of the living room and a glass filled to the brim with gin, he took a seat inside the chair with Marcus still in near presence. "Does it help?" the young boy genuinely asked Adrian after he watched him take a rather large sip of the incendiary, juniper-flavoured fluid, some days more so than others. The man responded quickly while retaining the friendly tone as his face underwent quite the visible transformation, shifting from uplifted to fairly glum. Gray noticed this immediately. "I am sorry, Mr. Clark. I should not have brought it up," the boy sincerely declared, having positioned his head down, collapsing under the weight of considerable guilt. "Not your fault, kid." Clark remedied the child's distress with a tender reaffirmation of his own, yet he wasn't quite done. "It's the war's fault, if anything," he concluded, having taken another substantial gulp of his medication. "You think about it often?" "The war?" Marcus asked the ex-combatant with a wavering voice, afraid to surface painful memories. "Some days more so than others," he truthfully said, chuckling to himself shortly afterwards. Not to sound like a broken record here. He might not have sounded like a broken record, but surely looked like one as he took yet another huge sip of the gin. "Don't do it, kid," Clark suddenly proclaimed with passion after a considerable interval of quietness. "Don't join the military. If you were ever thinking about it, that is. It's not worth it." He concluded his cautionary tale with the same passion present as before. Marcus reciprocated with a chuckle of his own before responding. "Wasn't going to, Mr. Clark," the boy stated whilst in the process of pulling out a sizable jigsaw puzzle. "Good." Adrian Clark spoke with relief and understanding. "And kid, you can call me Adrian," he then appended, looking directly at the little boy. Marcus remained quiet, having instead smiled at the man respectfully as Lady Evening began to knit her blanket of soothing darkness with the night briskly advancing throughout the vast city of London. The two had gotten along fine at first, with no notable incidents to share, however. That dynamic would eventually change with other fluctuations providing the substratum. One of these fluctuations was the woman herself, as more and more often Evelyn would be found not located at the house, which had begun fueling something rather undesirable and perhaps even unpredictable. Adrian Clarke would experience an escalation in intensity of his episodes, while at the same token finding himself much less capable of dealing with them than the times prior. This would become a force of considerable devastation to the man's already crumbling stability as he turned to the liquor for aid again and again. The heavier the episode, the heavier the administration of the medicament. Needless to say, this was not a path to liberation from the crippling infirmity, but rather one to a total mental collapse. This collapse would eventually show its ugly face, and more importantly, it would bring ugly acts alongside of it. On one of the nights, while the woman of the house was once again in another city on business, Adrian Clarke experienced one of the worst episodes he had in quite some time. Deeply affected by this, and in an effort to alleviate his unfavourable state, he began attempting to drown it in liquor. Glass after glass he would conquer, and before long the entirety of the bottle would be depleted, yet no escape from the prison of mental instability. No escape for young Gray either, as on that SME night, Adrian had lost control in its totality. For the first time ever, Adrian Clarke had stricken the young Marcus down, blinded by polarity and governed by frustration. The man was hardly himself, and was not nearly capable of the realization of his actions. The boy cried, but this was an effort in vain, as strikes would rain down upon the unfortunate child, bruising and cutting him open. The ill-fated Marcus was clearly no match for the former soldier, and was on the ground in mere moments, with Lady Consciousness no longer providing him with her embrace. Upon rediscovering responsiveness, Marcus was a spectator to a rather disheartening sight, as the man who had just recently blanketed the child with callous violence was now down on the ground, curled up like a ball while crying, not much unlike a child himself in truth. Sympathy had overrun the youngster as he rushed to the kitchen to locate certain medication that his mother had used in the past, which brought about the state of overwhelming repose. Whilst there was not much of it left inside the container, Marcus had mixed it in with tea in an attempt to potentiate it, as the medication was in a liquid form. Once the blend was complete, Marcus returned to the soldier to administer the sanguine mixture. The man had accepted this concoction, and it had achieved the desired effect, as the older male was now beginning to fragment the shackles of his medical defect. Eventually, Adrian Clarke would fall under the charm of deep slumber, while Marcus would attend to his most recent injuries. Once the mother had made her long-awaited return, Marcus was placed in a position requiring to now impart more information than he usually would be comfortable with doing, since the contusions that permeated the boy's skin were much too difficult to obscure. Marcus knew all too well what the disclosure of the culprit responsible behind his newly received wounds would do to his mother, so the boy once again found himself entirely indisposed to shatter her happiness. In addition, the child was submerged in a pool of empathy for her husband, as the young Marcus was more than intelligent enough to understand just the kind of appalling byproducts war can engender. Marcus lied to his mother when inquired about the bruises, opting to shift the blame on the local neighbourhood bullies instead, and while the mother was reluctant to believe her son at first, she eventually would submit to trust Marcus's explanation. A bullet dodged indeed, however. Sometimes it is better for the bullet to connect. Unfortunately, the prior described act of superfluous and dreadful violence was not a single-time occurrence, as the same exact scenario would play out again and again while under the same exact circumstances. The woman would be out of town yet again, and yet again Marcus would be the recipient of this rather dire punishment. Marcus's response to these incidents would also remain unvaried, as the boy would craft story after story explaining the lesions away and greatly lessening his mother's distress, while continuing to come to the aid of his assailant even, after the chains of the man's episodes eroded and he returned to a state of relative normalcy. However, change is the only constant, as they say, and quite the change to the typical did occur. On one of the days of May, in the year 1972, Clark would once again fall victim to yet another fierce episode while his dear wife was in Manchester, England. In fact, the man hadn't seen his better half in quite some time by this point, and this, alongside other factors, of course, had fueled an event truly harrowing and abhorrent. The most wicked of demons had visited the machinist on this night as the man steadfastly strode towards the room where the boy peacefully resided in. Immediately after the entry to the bedchamber, the serenity was no longer, decimated in the most violent of manners, as the big man grabbed the little 11-year-old Marcus and subjugated the unfortunate lad. Yes, the beating did commence, however, this was hardly the main course, if you will, for reasons that the man himself would not be able to apprehend, and while still a prisoner of his medical condition, the erstwhile trooper removed the young boy's shorts and underwear, placing him in a position most suitable for a certain act of indecency, and progressed to penetrate the youngling anally. Needless to say, the boy resisted with all his might, but this demonstration of opposition was one rather fruitless. The boy shrieked at the top of his lungs, hoping that someone would hear his cries and would come to rescue him from this unfortunate predicament, yet nobody heard and nobody came. The wails of the child surged once the act of insertion had begun, but this squealing would be swiftly pacified by the big man, as he firmly clamped his hand over the boy's mouth, while even hitting him numerous amounts of times to further reduce the force of resistance. One would hope that this was a quick procedure, so to say, but unfortunately that statement would be a lie. While this horrific and protracted act carried on, the boy felt himself gradually die with every passing moment, as the little man's tiny ship of security and well-being was ravaged by waves of acute physical pain, and bombarded by torrents of inexpressible emotional torment. Eventually, the little and helpless Marcus Gray would become fully acceptant of the abominable act forced upon him, having given up resistance and all forms of struggle in their entirety. Finally, the deed was finished, and with it was finished the boy's understanding and solicitude for this deeply broken man. Upon making her return from Manchester, Marcus unravelled the totality of the truth to his mother. Evelyn was stricken to her core. In fact, the woman struggled greatly to believe her son at first, as she simply was just not prepared to accept that the man who had delivered to her such an eminent boon of joy could commit such a horrid act. However, Adrian Clark followed Marcus's suit and admitted to guilt. Albeit the man had a rather fragmented remembrance of the tragic incident, when confronted by the mother, he could not lie any longer. The man had stripped the mantle of deception, and as a result of just this, Evelyn found herself in the shoes of a divorcee once more. The man was eventually arrested and charged with cruelty to children, yet this provided Marcus with hardly any fulfillment, as the damage had already been done. Marcus, much like the soldier himself, had now also underwent a complete and utter change of character, transforming and no longer possessing the compassion from before. With the tank of empathy beginning to run dangerously low, Marcus had become rather cold and quite distant. The shift of character would continue as the boy would now perceive ones around him, males especially, in a much different light than prior, and would often act accordingly with his newly founded impression. Marcus's anxiety, which chained him so often before, had now been replaced in its entirety. The emotion that supplanted the crippling fright was none other than towering hatred. When the heart becomes blackened by loathing, there is simply no room left for fear. Do unto others what has been done to you. Do unto others what has been done. A considerable interval of time had passed since the unfortunate incident with his stepfather had taken place, and while Marcus did experience a dramatic mutation of character, certain other aspects of his life remained unaltered. Just one of those aspects was his academic attainment, as the boy continued to be quite the unstoppable force when it came to just this matter. So much so, in fact, that the little Marcus had finished the totality of the high school program much quicker than most, having graduated at the age of 16 with the highest of honours. Marcus's mother, on the other hand, rediscovered her focus, if you will, and as a product of that shift, she no longer contemplated romantic involvement. Having removed the possibility of yet another marriage from her to-do list entirely, Evelyn had become much more closely involved in her son's life, and this was a truly instrumental development. Next dictate in the now teenager's life was enrollment into a distinguished university, as the indomitable freight train that was Marcus's intellectual prowess was not to be stopped. His mother would very much guarantee this, as she tried unremittingly to secure her son's admission into just such a respectable establishment, and great success she did achieve. In the autumn of 1977, Marcus Gray had officially begun his first semester inside the walls of the highly prestigious Imperial College of London while pursuing a major in arts and a minor in sciences. The academic programme, while most assuredly challenging, was still not hardly enough to trounce the brilliance of the teenager, however, as the scholarly achievement remained a constant in his life. Unfortunately, so did other trends. Marcus was still having great difficulty establishing any noteworthy connections with his peers, once again creating a gap between himself and others, and once again being relegated to a solitary quiddity as a product. With little options, as per usual, the plucky yet lonesome teen persevered on, conquering subject after subject, surprising professor after professor, and while this was not the existence the young man had desired, it was one that he was willing to tolerate. However, tragedy was not quite done with the youngster, as she planned to visit Marcus once again. A year and a half after his enrollment into the highly esteemed university, Marcus was dispatched with terribly debilitating news. Marcus's mother, the woman who meant more than anything else to the gifted man, had passed away in a bus crash while on her way to Birmingham. She was truly the only friend that the young Gray had. She was truly the only being whom Marcus could always rely on. She was the only one capable of truly understanding the boy, and suddenly she was no longer. Marcus's world came crashing down as reality forced her way through to torment him yet again. The boy was enslaved by a legion of emotions, with one following the other, but in the end only the sole sentiment had vanquished Marcus's spirit. This sentiment was hopelessness. The devastated Gray had given up completely, with the only person who brought him a sense of exuberance no longer being a part of his world. Marcus abandoned his academic pursuits, dismissed the advice of all and any who attempted to give it, and had established new friendships altogether. These new ties were not quite what one might expect, and possibly even hope for when it came to the youthful soul, as they weren't with his Aunt Helen or any professor or any human at all for that matter. The new relationships that the young Marcus had now acquired were with such substances as alcohol, cocaine, and even heroin. Gray had lost it all, his gift of self, his best friend-mother, and finally his will to live. January 1979 it was, And as the new year had just recently begun, the brilliant Marcus's life had promptly ended. Marcus Gray was found dead inside of a public restroom with slashed wrists on the outskirts of the great city that was London. Well, what is death really but not a state of mind? Yes, while the young boy certainly did expire on the inside, the reality is that he was still very much alive on the outside. The now 18-year-old had failed to perforate the radial artery, as he was most certainly not a professional when regarding the subject of suicide. Additionally, Lady Luck had made her grandiose entrance into the boy's life, as he had been found by a medical professional just inside that public restroom, which very few had ever entered, truth be told. While on her way south of London, a nurse had encountered rather unforeseen car troubles, and while waiting for the repair truck to save the day, she had made her way inside this clearly discarded and long abandoned structure. Completely deluged by the entirely unexpected sight, the nurse was hardly one to succumb to panic, as she rushed to the aid of the young boy with the speed of a fighter plane. Inside the car, she had all that was required to stop the bleeding and bring Marcus back to life. Once Marcus regained his ability to speak, the two had become enchanted by a fervent conversation considering the man's immediate future, as the nurse was adamant about Marcus requiring hospitalization, while the teen was less than willing to accommodate the woman's wishes. As more time had elapsed, Marcus had come out as a victor during this exchange, convincing the nurse of letting him go. Defeated and perhaps even unequipped to handle such matters, the nurse reluctantly obliged. Marcus had ran into death herself and won, promulgating a resolute change in his character once more. After the unsuccessful attempt of departing the planet, as is often the case, Marcus had been rejuvenated, having now reobtained a new goal and a new direction in life. The reinvigorated Gray decided that he would continue with his education, having already discussed this very matter with the university dean. However, while waiting for the academic year to roll back around, Marcus branched out his efforts in order to fill yet another void left by the tragic and sudden death of his mother. Marcus Gray desired a partner, and the young man would now begin to act against his own nature, choosing to leave the comfort of his home more and more often while attempting to find the aforementioned. Marcus would commonly visit local bars in hopes of meeting a suitable candidate, and on one of the warm and gentle summer nights, Gray had in his sights what he deemed to be a woman of earth-shattering beauty. She had long blonde hair, sparkling blue eyes, flawless skin, and a smile of an angel. In fact, she reminded him of his mother, quite so. With fear no longer a part of Marcus's equation, the young and freshly revitalized man approached the breathtaking woman, whilst overrun with confidence, however. Goddess Fortuna must have abandoned the teenager, as before he could even initiate a dialogue with the beauty, her boyfriend abruptly intervened. The man was drunk, a factor that should surprise absolutely no one considering the location which the three had occupied. However, a factor that might just surprise some was the boyfriend's reaction to the attempted advances nearly made by Marcus. "The lady is taken, you little creep," the man stated, with his comment being just as flammable as the drink he was carrying in his left hand. "She is out of your league anyway. Have you looked at yourself?" The man added yet another spice of ridicule to the already incendiary cocktail. "Stop being an asshole, Brian." The girlfriend joined the conversation, having added reproach in an effort to offset the pungent flavour of her boyfriend's comments. "Don't worry, babe," the man continued. "I got this. I will put this little twat back in his place where he belongs." The man was unrelenting with his barrage of insults while retaining the acerbic tone, deeply perturbed by Marcus's actions. "If you want to find someone, why don't you look at the local zoo?" the aggressive one added, drowning in self-approbation. Little Marcus, however, was quite amused by the most recent remark and had produced a smile as a result. This infuriated the alpha male, and in a much harsher tone he continued his verbal assault. "So, why don't you back the fuck off before I make you back the fuck off? How about that? Does that little brain inside that little head understand what I am saying?" While vocalizing his comment, the man began poking Marcus on the head with a smile of his own fully formed to return the favor. Marcus remained silent, and after a brief moment of time had just simply walked out of the bar. Mind you, this was not done out of fear, as the insults and threats which the man threw Gray's way meant very little to the youthful teen. The boyfriend, layered by pride, turned to his girlfriend, who was hardly content with how he handled this rather innocuous situation, and as a result, the couple had suddenly begun the proceeding of becoming engrossed in a rather heated exchange. Marcus was found just outside the bar at the back, smoking a cigarette. While his attempt was hardly a fruitful one, the night was still young. Gray fully intended to go back inside the bar soon enough to attempt his luck once again with another potential prospect. However, this effort would be hamstrung before it even had a chance to eventuate, as the same man who had just recently gratingly traduced the young Gray was now outside as well, striding towards Marcus with purpose. With some distance still separating the two, the alpha male began speaking. "Hey, you little faggot." The man's words resonated with deep resentment. "That girl fucking left me. The bitch left me at the fucking bar, and it's all because of you, lil cocksucker." The man's voice was fluctuating while he was nearing Marcus still. The alpha male's ego had taken quite the hit, it seemed, and he was hardly equipped to handle it. MG remained standing still, having just now finished his fag. Shortly after that, he produced a response. "You sure it's because of me?" Gray inquired rhetorically with an undertone of derision. "Maybe she left because you called her a bitch. Maybe if you showed some more respect towards the lady, then you wouldn't be requiring the services of your hand tonight." Marcus retorted with a fireball of his own, while the young man's voice remained entirely composed. The alpha male smiled with disdain, while now almost within reach of the youngster. "You are a comedian now, huh?" the alpha had threateningly asked, leading the young Marcus. "Well, let's see if you're going to think this is funny." The man's statement was a clear opener for violence as the much bigger male, which admittedly isn't that much of a statement considering the little Marcus was 5 feet and 3 inches tall on a good day, had now began to motion in the most appropriate of manners, resembling an incoming attack. Once the two were in grabbing distance, the alpha shoved Marcus, having now begun the preparation for a strike. Marcus was more than prepared to answer this call to violence, however. Little Gray had an ace up his sleeve, or more specifically, the youngster had a knife in his pocket, which he then proceeded to remove from the patch inside his jeans with speeds of a ninja. The boyfriend did not have an opportunity to respond since he found himself amid the motion of a swing. In an instant, Marcus had spiked the bigger man in the stomach. This had brought the alpha down to his knees. However, Marcus was hardly done as hatred once again took the reins to his carriage of stability, with the new roommate Misandry showing her face as well. Marcus continued his assault, while now stabbing the man directly in the face as he held his head steady as long as his strength would allow him to. The unabashed Gray had unleashed all of his pent-up frustrations, alongside his anger on this unsophisticated alpha male. The bottle of emotions had popped due to overflow. Marcus was unrelenting with his attacks. In fact, when all was said and done, Marcus Gray had stabbed the man over 20 times, perforating his cheeks, his eye sockets, and many other areas of the facial cavity. What is it that the kids say nowadays? Marcus fucked his shit up, isn't it? Well, he most certainly did, as the brutish boyfriend was no longer a resident of the realm of the living. Marcus stood tall over his victim, a complete reversal of the situation just moments prior. The old version of Gray would most surely have had panicked, but the new Marcus was to remain entirely unaffected by such an impotent emotion. The teenager dragged the body out of sight to the nearest garbage dispenser and progressed to dump the corpse inside the gigantic metallic container. Shortly after this act of obfuscation was complete, Marcus cleared quite the considerable distance away from the location of the bar while contemplating his next move. This rumination was not one that took much time, truth be told, as Marcus knew all too well that his chances of avoiding arrest were minuscule at best. Gray's most optimal, and perhaps only option, was to leave the city and even the country altogether. In the month of July of the year 1979, Marcus Gray had officially started his run from the authorities, and this, friends, is where this tale truly begins. Chapter 3. The future is grey. That's quite the story, said Dr. Sokolov, having paid heed scrupulously to the outings of the young Gray. Tell me, did you feel anything when you killed that man at the bar? Sokolov inquired while beginning to pace around the compact interrogation room. Can't say that I did, Doctor, Marcus Gray answered honestly, with the response producing a moderate sense of disappointment in oneself immediately after. Perfect, the doctor declared cheeringly, no longer bound by the shackles of frivolous emotions. That's quite the valuable development, my friend. The doctor was speaking in a tone closely resembling a family member while discussing uplifting familial affairs. A considerable amount of geniality had been injected into the good Dr. Sokolov. Gray had not provided much of a reaction to Alexander's comments, and instead opted to shift the conversation entirely. I am ready, Doctor, Gray stated with his head down and the dismay still beside him. Whatever for, Mr. Gray? Sokolov's inquiry was sheltered inside the house of puzzlement, as he had not quite anticipated the most recent sentiment provided by the young lad. To be experimented on, of course. Gray gunned out a response with confidence. It's what I've been brought here for, isn't it? He concluded with a leading inquest, fully expectant of the avant-garde procedures that awaited him. Expectations, however, often fall short, as the doctor's reaction was one that was deeply surprising to the young Marcus. Alexander's laughter had filled.